This is the After Glass Break series, and I'm your host, David Harrison. Throughout this series, we will take a candid look through the lenses of culturally diverse technology leaders to discuss their rise through the glass ceiling and what happened immediately after glass break. Today, we have a returning guest, my friend Eric Thomas, Global Diversity and Equity Inclusion Officer at Genesys. Eric, welcome back to the ride.
Hey, David, it's good to be back, man. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, so it was interesting to me when we last spoke. You were one of my earlier guests throughout the podcast, and some of the things you mentioned actually I carried through some of the other guests within the podcast. And just for the audience perspective here, what I'm doing today, this is our 10th episode After the Glass Break series, and we always need to take time and look back and honor milestones. So the 10th episode, what I plan on doing here today is a little bit different than what we've done in the past. Today is all about a retrospective. I want to get within in your head, Eric, and figure out what are some of the things that since we last spoke that you've taken forward. What are some of the learnings? What, for me, as I mentioned in my last podcast, this has been very therapeutic for me. Being able to discuss and talk about things in a manner that is allowing me to, take down some of the armor, put the shield down, put the sword down, understand that I'm not alone. So, I want to kind of get into your mind and get some retrospective views of some of the things that you've taken from the podcast, and in your role as a chief diversity officer, there's some things that you have to deal with on a daily basis to ensure that we are seeing diversity, equity, and inclusion across the brands here as we know it today. So with that, I just want to kind of kick it off with, so before we spoke, you and I, and everything open, Eric and I go back a long way. But we talked about things that you and I never just talked about in a business sense before, right? We never divulged some of the information about our past and some of our baggage and, as you call it, some of our superpowers that we picked up over time with some of the scars that we carry. So can you help the audience understand what are some of the things you got out of it? How did you come out of it feeling, and what are some of the things you took forward?
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed our session together. I'll use your term. It was definitely therapy for me. It forced me to reflect on some things that I hadn't thought about. Some things I hadn't thought about in a long time. Some things I hadn't even taken the time to think about. And when I think about, since that session, what's occurred, like what additional epiphanies or, revelations I've had, I would probably bifurcate them on two fronts, one personal and one professional. On the personal side, when we talked during the podcast the last time, one of the questions you asked me was about, kind of a childhood hero or a childhood mentor. And I referenced my dad and I talked about work ethic and all those things. And it really forced me to reflect on the role he played in my life, right? And we lost him to cancer. It's been 11 years this past December. And it's forced me to reflect on fatherhood in general, in terms of the type of father I am. I have two children. My oldest is 24-year-old Spelman alum. She's in graduate school in Miami. Right. And my youngest, my son, he's graduating from Howard this summer. And there was a lot of reflection on the role my dad played in my life, and making me reflect on the role I'm playing in his life. Am I giving him the same type of skills and attributes? Am I having the same type of impression on him? And it's becoming even more reflective given where he is. He's getting ready to graduate this summer from Howard, as I mentioned, and he's not looking at graduate school. So he's looking at, hey, I'm ready to go into the workforce. I'm ready to start this career journey.
Right.
And, you can't help but to reflect and think about, did I do a good enough job preparing him? He's a great kid, but, he's a 22-year-old and he's a little impulsive and, he's a risk taker, but he's a great kid. And I think that's, I've had a lot of thoughts without belaboring the conversation. I've had a lot of thoughts around my role as a father and the impact that I've had on him, when I think about my dad's role and the impact he had on me, wondering, did I set him up the right way for success? And of course, only time will tell. So I think that's probably one of the biggest personal reflections that's been heavy on me, given the timing of everything that's going on. On the professional front, I think when we last talked, I don't know how long it's been, maybe 6 or 8 months or so, I was still getting my feet settled into this diversity role. As I mentioned in the podcast last, I pivoted from working and running a business line into more of this cultural role where I'm have the responsibility of transforming or helping to transform the company's culture. And man, every week, every month in this role feels like a lifetime because of the amount of work that's required to really make a difference. The toll that it takes on you as an individual, as a leader, I'm required to be strategic, tactical, and operational all at the same time.
Correct.
As an African-American male, I have to compartmentalize my own feelings about certain things when they arise to make sure that I'm maintaining an objective perspective, because at the end of the day, I am the face of the company when it comes to this diversity work. And so being able to set aside whatever personal emotions I'm having to make sure that we are approaching different situations for the best of Genesys is a challenge within itself, but it's another superpower that I've had to develop and master to be able to really be successful and effective in this role. So those are probably some of the biggest learnings that I've taken away since we last connected on the podcast.
Very nice. One of the things you talked about was during your childhood. We talked about the sharecropper and how people think that's 250 years ago. We talked about some of the things of having mentorship, how your father was able to get within a different environment and pull you guys into a different environment based on his connections and the powers of connection and what connections give us in the networking space. In light of Buffalo and what happened during Buffalo, and can you help me understand, have your connections after the glass has broken, have they gotten stronger, or do you feel that there's tension in those connections that you've established professionally?
That's a great question. I think they've gotten stronger, David. And what I mean by that is that, like anything else, when you're building something from an instantiation point, over time, there's learnings, there's maturity, there's all these things that occur that allows you to move the needle forward. And I can think back on when the George Floyd murder happened, which was 2 years ago this past Wednesday.
Yes, sir.
How the leaders in the company were scrambling to understand how to react, how to respond. They knew they needed to do something, but there was no playbook, there was no approach. Fast forward to the mass shootings that occurred in Buffalo, where you had, it was a hate crime targeted against Black folks simply for the fact that they were Black. It wasn't as much of a scramble, and it wasn't as much of a, hey, let me pull your coattail and let's discuss, nudge you on what has to happen here, how we message this, what we need to do internally to make sure that we are demonstrating empathy for our employees who are reeling with this and who are reeling with the trauma from this event, and how this event can trigger old traumas.
Yes.
Folk understand now, and we sprung right into action. I can remember when learning about the shootings, it was Sunday morning, I got up, and that's when the news was really starting to spread. When I first got wind of it, and within a couple of hours, I was on the phone with our CEO, our head of HR, and our head of communications, triaging on, okay, this is what we need to do. This is the approach we're going to take. And then I had later on that afternoon, I had a call with the co-chairs of our Black Employee Resource Group. And basically what the net of that was, we sent a message out to the entire company, basically encouraging folk to protect their peace, recognizing what had occurred, recognizing that it's going to impact them when they show up to work, and that, we work to create a safe space in Genesys that allows them to process it in a way that they can protect their mental health, especially, recognizing that this month is Mental Health Awareness Month, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, so that message went out to all the employees. And I think what we've learned from that is that just by sending the message alone, it was internal, we didn't do anything external. It tells the employees that we see, we hear, we see it, we see what's going on, we recognize it, and we know that it's going to have an impact on you. And then the second phase was working with the co-chairs of our Black Employee Resource Group to host what we call an empathy hour, where you can go on a call and folk can get on the call, and it's almost like a releasing of your grief and a recognition that, okay, let's take an hour, let's get this out, let's process it in a safe way. We had a licensed counselor that came on that gave folk a few tips on how to manage the process and some things that they could walk through and apply to again managing their mental health.
Right.
And then we left that, and our Black Employee Resource Group is facilitating a company-wide campaign raising money for the victims and the families that were impacted from Buffalo. So when you think about all that happened within a matter of a few days, and you think about where we were 2 years ago trying to scramble just to understand how to even talk about this, major progress. And I attribute that to the networking, the increased relationships, and more importantly, I think the increased understandings of the individuals in the network, right? Regardless of what your background is, to understand, the realities of these situations that they incur and the impact it has on our employees.
That's very nice. I mean, the springing into action is something that I think is extremely important. And again, now that you've broken through the glass ceiling, your voice carries a little bit more weight. And because your networking and your relationships have been strengthened, this is where the power of diversity comes into play, right? And the need and the effort that what diversity can bring to an organization, and not just the rah rallying cry, but concrete deliverables and actions that we can bring to bear associated when things like this happen. We had last year here at Bottle Rocket, we call them safe rooms, similar to what you're talking about with the hour conversation. We had a safe room set up in the anniversary of the George Floyd that I ran that safe room personally. And it was, again, an opportunity to grieve, and not only just opportunity to grieve, but an opportunity to learn. One of the key aspects about, I always use the term ignorance. And the problem with the ignorant is ignorant don't need to be taught. And you learn from communicating, you learn from involving, you learn about the different ways that people live, breathe, and operate. And what you find out, and this was very compelling for me doing this series, is that we're more alike than we're different.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you say that, because part of the work I've come to appreciate about diversity, equity, and inclusion is just establishing a common language and getting on the same page with the definitions of what each are. Because sometimes I think folks take for granted that people know that. And it's one of the things that hit me probably almost a year in, that using the term DEI or DEIB or however you espouse the acronyms, you may as well be saying soda pop to some people.
Exactly.
They don't really understand it. So we have taken the time to define what each is. And our definition of diversity is going to be different from different companies to different environments, because it can take on such a broad spectrum of meanings. But our definition of diversity is recognizing the rich differences of the makeup of our global workforce, but at the same time realizing that we all have a shared humanity. And that's the approach we take, because it's very easy when you are leaning in on recognizing those differences for folks to say, oh, well, you're trying to divide and separate us. You're trying to create division. No, it's not a matter of creating division. It's a matter of recognizing that we all have different lived experiences, And by you not recognizing those lived experiences, the differences in them, you are otherizing me, or you want to homogenize me. You want to whitewash the fact that I have dealt with things differently, or maybe I haven't had as much privilege as certain groups have had. And it's a recognition of putting all that on the table. But as you said, also understanding that at the end of the day, when you sort through it all, we all have a very shared, a very dominantly shared common humanity.
Yeah, there's a common thread that binds us.
Right.
We tend to ignore that common thread based on societal influences and the lack of, I don't know the best way to say this, the lack of personal accountability when it comes to understanding that there's one race, and that's the human race.
Right.
And, we've divided ourselves in a manner that is not very capable of understanding that we're all humans.
Right.
We've lost that in the annals of time, that I bleed, you bleed, my heart, your heart,
Right.
my family, your family.
Look at what just happened in South Texas. I mean,
Yes.
it's one thing that we all, if you're a parent, we all bled or shed tears for those parents.
Yes.
And it didn't matter what the hue or racial or ethnic makeup was of those kids. Loss of a child in a tragic way like that, if you're a parent, you can't help but to bleed
Yes.
or cry for the other parent, have that bleeding heart for them.
Yep.
And I think that's a perfect example of how how common our humanity is.
Exactly. And the audience, I'm sorry, we digressed a little bit because of you kind of expected, considering the climate and the events that just happened here over the past few weeks. And it's very important that we really address that as well. We're both Black men, if you will. We both were affected across the board here with Buffalo, and then conversely, what just happened with kids, right? So it is important, again, the power that you carry when you break the glass ceiling, and the ability to invoke thought change and influence, to help others see that it is not that we're different, is more that we're alike, and that the fact that we're alike, we need to share common sorrows.
Yeah.
And that's really the ties that bind, if you will, across the human race. So getting back, I'm sorry again, we had to address that. I had to address that. Again, this is a therapeutic session for me as well, and it allows me to also address some of the things that is happening real time, and what we call our space and our environment.
Right.
So one of the things you talked about in our last session was, and we talked about a little bit as well, having the push and the drive and the understanding that where we came from is not where we want to go back to. Right. We talked about that quite a bit. Right. And can you help the audience understand, since we've had that conversation, what are some of the things that you look back on? And again, we discussed this a little bit before we started. My first time going back to Georgia since 2017, and some of the pains that I had to deal with, but I was able to get those pains out during these conversations, and no longer feel that way when I go home. What were some of the things you've taken from that, now that you've understood and had a moment of reflection around those words? There's nothing here for you. You need to go forth and be your own person.
Man, it's interesting. The timing of this, our connecting today, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I met up with a number of friends that I grew up with, that I've known since kindergarten, right?
Wow.
And we're often different, leading different lives, obviously in different parts of the country. But we came together in Austin, Texas 2 weeks ago. 4 of us did, rented a nice little Airbnb, and we were there for Cigar Fest. But really the best time spent was sitting around that patio in that house and just catching up. And, I think one of the things that dawned on me is how easy it can be for us to get caught up in our own reflections of our own experiences, not really understanding how some of the people that you were so tightly connected with, what experiences were they having?
Right.
What lens were they seeing? What was their lens on things? And as we sat around and had conversations and reflected on old times, talked about old, we all played sports together. We were all, same basketball, football team, small town. So of
Right.
course those stories come up, and every time you tell a conversation, somebody's remembering it a little bit
A
differently.
little bit different.
The line gets expanded, just it gets a little bit more expanded from what you told it before. But what was most compelling for me is when we did talk about certain traumas growing up and reliving it and sharing, having the conversation amongst us, how differently other folks saw that situation, and the impact it had on me and how I was able to recontextualize the situation through their lens. And it just gave me a different appreciation for my relationship with these men, right? Because it's a different relationship I have with them now, some 30, 40 years later,
Right.
than what we had growing up. We're not the same people that we were. But we have, our memories are our memories. And I think it just forced me to get outside myself. And all this time I've been carrying my memories through my lens, and I have a newfound appreciation and a newfound perspective on my childhood based on the sharings that I heard from my friends and them sharing their lens of the things that they saw. It was pretty interesting.
That is absolutely fabulous. That I can honestly sit here and tell you I couldn't find or even fathom anyone that I went to kindergarten with and who they are and what they are today. So,
Well,
the fact
like I said, I grew up in a very small town,
this is true.
and so I have some friends for life. From I mean, literally, I remember showing up the first day of kindergarten. They paired you up with buddies, right? And
Yeah.
Quincy was one of the guys they paired me up with, and he was just at my house a month ago, just hanging out for the weekend. I'm 40 some years later. So I've been fortunate in that regard. We hadn't done the best at keeping in contact with each other, but then we're trying
Right.
to be more intentional about it now.
That is unbelievable, man. And again, we talk about the cultural lenses as we talked about after the glass break and getting a view through all those lenses. The lenses, and I can't remember the name of the movie. Forrest Whitaker was in it, and it was about an assassination attempt, and they show the attempt through multiple lenses and how everyone saw it a bit differently and experienced
Right.
that event a bit differently. And those
Right.
experiences, once you tie them together, you then understand that even though we were there together, even though we experienced together, your makeup defines how you experience that. So one of the things that, yeah, absolutely. One of the things my wife says all the time, you can't tell me how to feel,
Right.
because you don't have my makeup.
Right.
And you don't carry my scars, you don't carry my baggage.
Right.
So and that's really some of the key tenets about being in a diverse culture here, is that
Right.
we all have different approaches to how we do things, and the better we understand those approaches and the better we coalesce around that, the stronger we become.
Right.
So
yeah, definitely agree. Definitely agree. Definitely agree.
So it is when I was growing up, one of the things that really affected me is, and you talked about having your stepfather, your that helped guide you. I lacked that growing up, and I constantly was trying to reach out and find it,
Yeah.
trying to find someone that I could latch on to and model. My mom was my rock and my strength and my pillar, right?
Right.
She taught me to be responsible. She taught me to be able to maintain my own household. She taught me finances. She taught me how to clean, cook, iron, take care of things, but she couldn't teach me how to be a man. And one of the things that I kept trying to latch on, and then my oldest brother was the person that would latch on. He was, he was a local, you have those blacktop heroes, right? So everyone knew my brother, right? So he was like the blacktop hero in Columbus, Georgia. And so I would try to latch on and have him, try to guide me, but he just never had time for me, right? And so I always struggled in that and finding the way. So, one of the things you talked about was having the strength of your father, which is you're calling your father to help you find the way. How are you now in retrospective doing the same thing? You talked about your kids a little bit, but how are you applying that same helping people find the way now that you've broken through the glass ceiling?
Primarily through mentoring, David. And I have a soft spot, and I'll just have to be transparent with this, for young Black professionals in this space.
Hmm.
And I probably have way more people than I should that I mentor, because when folk ask, I feel an obligation to support them and say yes. Now, I'm clear that the onus is on them to maintain the relationship and to maintain the cadence, how often we connect and speak.
Right.
But, I can remember having my father there to kind of set the foundation for me, and it kind of, instill the work ethic and the drive. But then you and I also had a conversation about, I think you used the term, what you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
And then I think I mentioned that, from leaving college into transition into corporate America, that was a little bit of time there where you felt a bit in the wilderness, and that you
Yes.
had to kind of sort things out on your own, because I didn't have an ecosystem of Black corporate executives guiding me through that. Right.
Correct.
But I was fortunate enough to have a number of people that come into my life that kind of helped me navigate the landscape, but they didn't look like me. They didn't have the same shared experiences. Nonetheless, their role in my life was extremely valuable, right? And I think now, reflecting back on that, I probably over rotate on being available for young Black professionals early in career, or ones that are maybe 5 to 10 years in, and they show a tremendous amount of promise, and now they're trying to figure out how to navigate breaking through the different ceilings that they're working through.
Right.
And I try to make myself available, to be there for them, to share my experiences, to share wisdom, to share perspective, mainly because I didn't have that from someone that looked like me. And I think that's personally, I stayed personally invested in those relationships, in those situations. And then on a more formal scale, as a DEI officer, I mean, man, we are very intentional about mentoring and sponsorship programs for women and people of color, groups that have been traditionally marginalized or shut out from opportunities. It is a unapologetic, dogmatic approach at breaking down all systems that have traditionally contributed to that, and replacing them with ones that operate in a more equitable fashion. And honestly, that's the nature of the role that I've come to appreciate.
Very nice. That is powerful, because it's the concept behind, and this comes from the doctor's world, but see one, do one, teach one, right? See it, do it, understand it, and then teach. And those are the principles by which, at least in my later career, I've adopted. In my earlier career, I didn't care about that.
You didn't know the care.
Yeah, I did not know the care at all. I didn't. It was grind, 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 grind. No one's going to help you. No one believes in you. Your whole life, you've been left behind. Grind, grind, grind. And it wasn't until later in the career what I realized was that your best attribute is your ability to give back
Yeah.
and to help and to teach. And forever, I just did not believe that. I believe my best attribute was that I can outthink you. I got to run harder, faster, and quicker than you.
I'm
And
going to
as long
outwork
as,
you.
yeah, and outwork you. My job was to outwork you. And
Right.
you may have had a better education than me. You may have had better upbringing than me. You may have had things that I didn't have. But my mentality was I will outwork you. And because I will outwork you, you would never beat me.
Right.
Everything was a competition in life for me. Everything was driven because I always felt as if I didn't get the breaks or I didn't get the mentorship needed to be self-serving, right? So I became more introspective and more driven around this me against the world. And those were qualities that I adapted over life because of some of the things we talked about before, that lack of a true father figure in my life until I became in my 20s where my stepfather stepped in at that point in time in my life. And, military background, I start seeing things in him that I didn't have. And then conversely, in my 30s, when I was grinding like a madman and trying to get a director position, my whole life was like being a director. My whole being was about the identity of the position and not the person in the position. And so that grind, when I got my directorship, I associated everything I was David the director versus David the person. Right. And that's because it was only thing I thought about. And I thought that was the ceiling for me. And I had reached it and I was angry. I was just mad all the time. I didn't know why I was mad, but I was really, really angry all the time. And I did something that us Black folks don't do. I decided to go to counseling and figure out why I was so mad.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
And
David, you reached that point in your career. You and I kind of talked about this before about, hey, I'm a director now. I've made it. I can rest on my laurels. I can be content.
yeah.
And that was probably one of the many, glass ceiling breaking moments you've had. And then you talked about going into counseling. Tell us a little bit about like how things progressed from there, because obviously you were a C-level exec now, so there were additional glass ceiling breaking moments. How did you break through this situation? It wasn't just a glass ceiling that you were breaking through. You were also working through some of that oppressive veil that you probably was carrying with you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, that oppressive veil, and we talked about this a little bit during our first session, was my view of everyone. In my mind, everyone saw me as a lesser, right? I walk in a room, I'm physically imposing at my height and size, and the looks I got in the room was like, oh, he must be one of those guys they just let in the door. And
Right.
that was my thinking. Probably wasn't thinking in the room, but that was my thinking, and that fueled my anger. And that anger manifested itself in me working 10-hour days, trying to gain as much knowledge as I can to outthink everyone in that room, to let them know that there was a sense of belonging, that I belong there. Now, man, mind you, no one in the room said it. And it was me carrying that weight of growing up in the South and always being seen as a lesser that fueled my anger, fueled my fire, and fueled my commitment. Now, while I was doing all that, my personal life was falling apart. And so there was no balance. And I reached a point, I was 35, I think. I reached a point that I'm like, something is broken in me. I didn't trust anyone. I won't let anyone close to me. I didn't accept mentorship because I thought people were just out for themselves and were setting me up for failure.
Right, right.
And it was the veil that I had put inside me of I'm an inferior. And because I'm an inferior, I must overcome constantly.
And you're probably feeling like an imposter in a lot of scenarios too.
Exactly. That whole imposter syndrome was real.
Yeah.
And, I'm here, but do I belong? Did I get some boost along the way that I didn't see? Did the wind carry me somewhere that I didn't know? And
Right.
so it was time that that imposter syndrome, because I felt like I was less. I didn't go to the big schools. I didn't have
Yeah.
the MBAs and the PhDs, as you know, in our world, in that
Harvard
life.
and Yale. And,
Yeah,
yeah.
I didn't have that in my portfolio. So it drove me to a position of anger at everyone. And I realized that something was broken in me.
Hmm.
No one told me that was something that's broken. I realized that something is broken. And I was just angry for I wake up angry. And that's when I would put it in the gym. I would put it in my work, and I didn't care about anybody.
Yeah.
And
David, it's an interesting phenomenon. And you didn't say the word, you were angry for no reason, but that's a bit of the sentiment. And I would challenge you and any of us who have been in those shoes to acknowledge that you had every reason to be angry. You just didn't know why,
yeah,
right? When you think about the upbringing and growing up in a single parent household, and your mom being your primary caregiver and primary provider, and doing it as a house worker, and not having a father in your life for a number of years for whatever reason. So these are very common stigmas that we see in our community. Some of these are decisions we make as individuals, of course, that we have to have some responsibility about, but there are
right,
also a lot of things that was systemically set up to create these types of environments. And it's a fascinating use case because I think we as individuals, there's a lot of power in coming to understand and know that.
right,
And I think I mentioned it on our last podcast. There's power in being able to contextualize those circumstances and why you were thinking the way you were, behaving the way you were, and what was fueling you. And it's okay to be able to recognize that there were some external stimulators that led to that, um, without you making yourself the victim, right? And
right,
I think that's where a lot of those superpowers get developed.
correct.
And I think there's a lot of power in understanding that will allow you to move forward and just operate in a different way. And it sounds like you work through some of those scenarios to kind of get to where you are today. Maybe talk a little bit about whether it was from the counseling or just self revelations. Like, what did you discover, and what is it that you've had to kind of break through? Maybe a personal glass ceiling, right?
Yeah.
To get beyond David the person before you even have to fight the system itself.
One of the things coming out of that's kind of a really good setup to go into some of the details of my life. But one of the things that I had to learn was self-worth.
Hmm.
I didn't have self-worth. And because I didn't have self-worth, I constantly believe I was never good enough.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of us suffer through that. I suffered terribly through it. I would make up in my head a world that I wanted to come from versus the world I came from.
Right.
So I literally created inside of me, you're not that David, you're going to be this David. And this is
Right.
who you're going to represent every time you go out the door. And you're not going to let anyone know about who you really are.
Right. Wow.
And that was kind of the crux of the problems that I created for myself.
Wow.
And I had got so consumed into the imposter syndrome. I've got so consumed into the dichotomy of myself that I didn't even realize that I'd always thought I'd be dead by 40 anyway. So I didn't really care that I was killing myself. And coming out of counseling and realizing that there was self-worth, and realizing that within your self-worth and self-respect, your upbringing, who you are, where you came from is very important.
Yeah.
And to set that aside like it didn't exist was causing me the struggle and strife through life, was causing me not to trust someone because I wasn't my authentic self.
Yeah.
It's hard to open up and trust and believe when you don't trust and believe yourself.
Or when you hate yourself.
Or when you hate yourself.
Yeah. And I don't think a lot of people, and what you just described is, and I can totally relate to my upbringing, being taught to be ashamed of who you are because you have less.
Yes.
Or being taught to hate who you are because you look different. I can remember as a kid growing up, man, it's funny, but it's not. We used to put perm and processes in our hair.
Yes.
Probably why I can't grow any hair to this day. And at the time, we didn't know why, but our hair as a Black man, your hair is naturally kinky, naturally curly. We wanted it straight and silky smooth because that's how the white boy's hair was.
Yes, exactly.
And you wanted to assimilate into that environment. So you put that process in your hair to straighten your hair, not even having any appreciation for how beautiful you already were with your own natural hair. Now you're modifying a part of you that isn't natural for you, and now paying the price for it some years later, right? But
exactly.
But it's just an example of how that environment you grew up in, you can be taught to hate yourself. And I think part of the process that you had to go through in reconciling those two Davids, yes, there's some responsibility that we take on the choices we make in life. There's always self-accountability, but it's also recognizing that that's something that was taught, and you shouldn't have to carry the blame for a lot of that. I think it also has to be a part of that healing and reconciliation to give you that confidence to stand tall, to be the 6'5" David that you actually are, 6'6". I think you're somewhere at that height, brother, and stand with that imposing figure in confidence, right? And it's interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon that I don't know a lot of us have had the opportunity to process and work through the way that you have.
Thank you. Yeah, it was tough, and for all my listeners out there, this is kind of an important spot in the podcast that I want to kind of, considering that it is Mental Health Awareness Month here.
Yes.
We all suffer through things, and that suffrage is sometimes self-inflicted. In my world, a lot was self-inflicted. A lot was anger because I felt like I was left as a kid from my father. Abandonment issues carried through a lot of that struggle in my life. Right. The ability to relate, release, and let go is a superpower in itself.
Yeah.
That I struggled with mentally throughout my 20s and 30s. And understanding that, not to coin the phrase, you are somebody,
right?
But you are. We are. And you have to recognize that it's okay. And because it's okay, you're okay.
Right.
And that would allow you then to open up and bring all that past forward and have the wisdom to start educating ourselves with the humility of where we come from and what we had to achieve to get here. I'm not saying Eric and I are, superheroes. We're not. We're just like everyone else. But what I'm saying is that within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space across the spectrum, whether you come up from within a Black environment, brown environment, Asian environment, when you mix outside those cultures and you start mixing with other cultures, it's okay to have self-worth in those conversations. It's okay to feel like I am capable and I can do things. And it's okay to go, I want to express and teach. The more you get into the see one, do one, teach one, the more you will open yourself up to capabilities that you never thought you had. And the more you will realize that a lot of what we call disparate things that may have happened to us growing up were things that were not meant to bring us down, but it was meant to build a foundation of strength that we can grow on. That's a lot of things to say. To basically sum it up is the capabilities that exist in one exist in all. There is no one in the human race inherently greater or lesser than anyone else. We're all imbued with certain capabilities that we can take advantage of and we can use across the board to make this a greater place.
Yeah, it's I couldn't agree more. And your heartfelt shares reminds me of the South African concept called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu basically says, I am because we are. And it speaks to that shared humanity that we all have across all the races, right? I am because we are. And it's a powerful concept, powerful saying. And today's been really good conversation, David. I appreciate you inviting me back, man. I've learned more about you, even though you and I go back every time we have these conversations. I learned so much about you, and I appreciate you demonstrating the courage to be vulnerable, because that's another, I think, teaching or something that we have to relearn or unlearn.
Correct.
Is what does strength look like? Masculinity, right? And I don't think we're taught that vulnerability is a strength. We're taught that vulnerability is a weakness. And it's one of the things I've learned as well over the last couple of years is how much of a strength vulnerability really is, because it allows you to come to certain truths that you can't get to without it. And you give permission to people around you to do the same thing. So I appreciate that vulnerability today, man. It's been an awesome conversation with you. And I appreciate the courage you've displayed. I learned a lot from it. I always do.
Well, thank you, my friend. I appreciate you coming back. It's been a great ride, as it always is. And to my listeners, I'll leave you with this, because it's very important considering the month that this has been recorded. Mental health is the key to a lot of discord that exists in this country. It is okay to be okay. Do not feel that because you're okay, that you're not as good as the person next to you. We're all just okay. And just okay, you know what? That's all right. With that, thanks again. I appreciate it. This has been great, Eric. Until next time, love you all.
Thanks, Dave.